So, I am white, and I am also Indigenous. Cherokee Nation to be specific, and not just like my grandmother was a Cherokee princess. I mean, like, I'm an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation. For you, Cherokees out there, will this focus? Welcome to my makeup tutorial. That's my blue card. I won't show you the front of it because it's got, obviously, identifying information on it, but, enrolled citizen, baby. I live in Oklahoma currently, and there are many, many people here who are either Cherokee or have Cherokee ancestry, and there are many, many more tribes and cultures here as well. And none of us know how to drive. Driving skills are a colonizer concept. However, I did not grow up here. I was not raised in the culture. My mom and her parents, who are my Cherokee side of the family, would tell me what it was like to be Cherokee or things about Cherokee history and culture, even if my mom grew up also in a very colonized way, if you'd like to call it that. Both of my parents were insistent that I learn things about Cherokee history, and so whenever we went to Oklahoma when I was a kid, we would visit important places of significance to Cherokee culture and history. So I knew that I was Cherokee, but I didn't really know what that meant or what that felt like. I will say that I moved to Oklahoma less than a year before the pandemic started, so by the time I was an adult and actively ready to engage with my culture, it became impossible to go out to meet people and to talk to people that were not my family that I already knew. It has gotten a lot easier as COVID restrictions have lifted, even if they lifted a little too early. It's become a lot easier to connect with and to support Indigenous communities, whether through at-large citizen groups, Indigenous-owned businesses, or cultural gatherings. Entire communities of what we call reconnecting natives exist, trying to build each other up and support each other as we unlearn colonized lifestyles and mindsets. Many of us are third, second, and first generation survivors and victims of government programs designed to eradicate native cultures. From boarding schools, allotments, the policy of termination, and even the Trail of Tears do still affect people around the country today. As for me, I grew up in Missouri, and there were not a lot of resources for young Indigenous kids in my very white suburban city. I knew that I was Cherokee, but I was alone. And for many of the kids that I grew up with, I was unfortunately the only window into Cherokee culture and history that they ever had, and even really just Indigenous or native culture and history at all. And I routinely had kids at school tell me they thought all the Indians were dead. Much of our young lives are spent looking for ourselves in fictional characters, and unfortunately for me, I didn't see The Legend of Korra until I was in college. The show didn't even come out until I was in high school, but a younger version of myself would have learned a lot from Tenzin. Now, clearly, the real struggles of Indigenous people cannot be 100% equated with the fictional struggles of the air nomads. But if you've ever watched a YouTube video essay, then you know that fiction helps our shaping of reality. The character of Tenzin, as well as the rebirth of airbenders, provide an interesting view for us to look into the struggles of peoples after genocide. So the structure of this video is going to be a little bit different than my other videos. I think it's going to flow a little bit more naturally and be less rigid than I usually like to keep my scripts. And that's because this is not really like a I'm trying to convince you of something kind of video, but more of a I just think this is interesting and we should look at it kind of video. Cheers. I'm going to be looking at Tenzin's experiences and compare them to my own. Of course, I don't speak for every Indigenous person or every reconnecting Indigenous person, every person who is recovering and surviving the struggles of imperialism and genocide, etc. This is just a case study for myself that might be interesting or useful to other people. A brief pause to thank this video's sponsor, me. No, seriously, it's Pride Month. Whoops, it's November. I was originally going to plug my Pride Month stickers here, which are now for sale on my Teespring store. I have moved from Redbubble to Teespring, even though it's no longer Pride Month. These are still available year-round. Sorry, this video took too long. I wasn't happy with the first draft. We had a natural disaster here in Tulsa. I had my wisdom teeth removed, and I was in a musical. So it's been a long 4 months, but it's Native American Heritage Month, so this video is still relevant. So buy my stickers. And thank you to the other sponsors, my supporters on Patreon. If you want to support me on Patreon, the link is in the description. So let's get on with it.
Yes, get on with it!
Right away, let's address some major differences between Indigenous people and the air nomads. I know that's a big umbrella, Indigenous people, but let's address it. The first difference is that not every Indigenous culture is nomadic. And I guess that not every airbender is nomadic either, but the great majority are, or were before genocide, moving between the 4 air temples. Secondly, the new airbenders that we see in season 3 and 4 are not a direct comparison or comparable really at all to anything that exists in the real world. It is possible that people discover that they have Indigenous ancestry and might even be eligible for citizenship of a tribe later on in their life, but new Indians don't just pop out of nowhere. Another important and complicated distinction is in the word Indigenous. The word Indigenous means literally to be from a place. We use this term interchangeably with Native American or Indian or whatever word you are familiar with. When referring to Native Americans or natives of a place, the word Indigenous sometimes is accurate 100% and sometimes not. The Cherokee, for example, as a culture, aren't even originally from Oklahoma. The modern Cherokee Nation is here because of the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee culture is indigenous to the southern Appalachians, which is where the Eastern Band still reside. But a big part of Indigenous identity is having a strong connection and relationship to the land that you live on, that you're indigenous to. The air nomads were originally indigenous to certain regions of the world where air temples are located. The new air mads are mostly from the Earth Kingdom, and all over it at that. These people don't have a connection to any land that is traditionally associated with the air nomads or their culture. Another important and even more complicated distinction is familial ties. And I'm not talking like blood quantum here. I'm talking about like genealogical family tree type stuff. Familial links are essential in Native communities. Native people use family trees and familial links to associate and connect with other members of their tribe and beyond. Genealogy, whether or not blood quantum is involved, is how citizenship is determined. For example, in the Cherokee Nation, if you are a Cherokee citizen, it means that one of your ancestors was on a very specific census called the Dawes Roll. For the better part of like a year and a half now, almost 2 years, oh my god, I've been working on a video about Cherokee heritage and ancestry and all of the drama that comes with it and people claiming that they are Cherokee even though they are not and that whole thing. So like, that's the shortest version I can give you. The air nomads, on the other hand, to our knowledge, are not concerned with direct family ties. And that was because the community was their family. And the same is true for many indigenous cultures, but the airbenders don't like know who their mother or father are. Does that make sense? They're even less so concerned with familial ties now that new airbenders have literally sprung out of nowhere. There are no airbending families or clans or whatever terminology a tribe might use to connect them to. They don't have them. It's like when you're playing The Sims and you like start a new file and you create a new sim that like doesn't have a family tree yet. Like they just exist. Anyway. And yes, these people have families, but they are not associated with air nomads or airbending culture in any way. So let's talk about Tenzin. Much of Avatar: The Last Airbender was focused on, well, Aang being the last airbender. He's alone. But the show didn't really have time to focus on his rebuilding of his culture. It does touch on this in the comics, but the burden really is left to Tenzin. The first show in the series is called The Last Airbender, but I don't know if a lot of people realize that Tenzin, for a period of his life, was also the last airbender. Between the death of his father and the birth of his first child, he too was alone. He is the sole authority on airbending as a martial art and air nomad culture, and his only exposure to those things were from his father. Tenzin did not grow up an air nomad in the traditional sense. Aang may have taken him around the world to show him his culture, but they were history lessons in empty temples. From an anthropological standpoint, Tenzin is not an air nomad, and I'm not Cherokee in any sense but politically. Because of imperialism and genocide, neither Tenzin nor I got to grow up in the culture that was ours to be a part of. But Tenzin and I are working to reclaim and reconnect. I am arguably in a much better position as the Cherokee culture is still alive and well, and I don't have an entire planet looking to me to be the sole authority of Cherokee history and culture. Thank God. Watching Tenzin struggle helps me work through my own, because unlike Tenzin, I'm not alone. Now, Tenzin does have his immediate family, but not an entire community, or the internet. Tenzin is not an air nomad. He's an airbender, yes, but he lives a colonized lifestyle, if you'd like to call it that. He grew up in a nuclear family, not surrounded by a community. We don't know a ton about Tenzin's childhood, other than Aang obviously favored him over his other children. He did take Tenzin around to the air temples, but the frequency of these trips is unknown. Even so, they would have been the only ones there. There was no community. Tenzin's pseudo-cultural experience might feel very familiar to reconnecting natives, especially if we're just starting our journeys or if we grew up far away from Indigenous communities. While Cherokee communities absolutely do exist and are very much active, they were not active in my hometown. And like I said, my parents did take me to important cultural and historical sites. The Cherokee National Capitol building, homes of important people, grave sites of my ancestors, even the Confederate ones, etc. But very little of the time was there a large community presence. Going to Oklahoma with two small children was certainly possible, but not time-wise or financially feasible just for us to go any weekend that we wanted. Speaking of family, like most people in Republic City, he has a wife and children and lives in a nuclear family unit. From what we know about air nomad culture, children are raised communally rather than having one or two parental figures. Yes, there are the air acolytes, but they are not equals to Tenzin by any means. They aren't benders, nor were they raised in the culture. But Tenzin and his family live on Air Temple Island and don't really become nomadic until season 3. So his kids do grow up a little more nomadic than he does. David Cornsilk is a controversial but nonetheless important figure in the Cherokee world. He often states that it is not culture until it shows up in the children. I am inclined to agree with him on this point. You can see this idea in action in Tenzin's kids, Jinora especially. I'd argue that Jinora is the beginning of the reborn Air Nation, not Tenzin. She has the built-in community that Tenzin did not, even if that community didn't really show up until she was 12 or so. She is spiritual and is the first airbending master in a generation. And she really does become nomadic starting in season 4, when she and the other airbenders travel the Earth Kingdom trying to restore balance while Korra is recovering. Jinora is an incredible character and deserving of her own video, but as an extension of talking about Indigenous issues, she's a great example of where a recovering culture really begins. But let's go back to Tenzin. One of Tenzin's central character conflicts is that he is not a very spiritual person.
Dad, I failed you. I am no spiritual leader.
While he is a master airbender, he is frustrated with himself for not being as spiritually connected as his daughter Jinora. Jinora can talk to spirits, she can astral project, etc. Tenzin can't so much as go to the spirit world, even though he's supposed to be the Avatar's spiritual guide. And while I'm sure this wouldn't make Tenzin feel any better, that does make sense. For many Indigenous people, community is spirituality. And even for non-Indigenous people, this idea is still relevant. Like, if you go to church, you are engaging in spirituality through a community setting. Yes, some spirituality is a solo act, but large parts of human spirituality are reinforced through communal means, whether through group worship or prayer or ritual or what have you. So community is spirituality. And Tenzin has never had a community. Aang did for the first 12 years of his life, but he was also the Avatar, so you could say that he had a spiritually unfair advantage. But Tenzin's entire spiritual experience is what he's read about in books, and whatever he learned from only one person, Aang. Tenzin is great at meditating, but airbender community ceremonies and rituals were not part of his upbringing. They couldn't be. But Tenzin gets an opportunity in Season 3. Harmonic convergence creates new airbenders all over the world. The biggest difference between Tenzin's experience and the experience of Indigenous people, in North America at least, is that the people he's trying to rebuild a culture with aren't folks who historically are connected to his culture in any way. And Tenzin is asking a lot of them to give up the lives, the families, the livelihoods, the material possessions that they know and are familiar with, to uproot their whole lives and go start or restart a culture that they have no physical or emotional or historical connection to. And Tenzin has to come to terms with the fact that not everybody who becomes an airbender wants to also become an air nomad. And I mean, there are plenty of people who are legally Cherokee who won't or can't be bothered to learn any Indigenous practices at all, to engage with a community on any level, to learn about their tribe's history, language, or culture, or even to be bothered to care about the tribe's well-being at all, Governor Kevin Stitt.
I've actually got my Indian card. My 6 children with blonde hair and blue eyes, they all have their Indian card.
There's also something to be said about Bumi not feeling like he ever was a member of the nation, even though his father was. Because Bumi did not become an airbender until adulthood. You know, you could equate this to people who don't look stereotypically native, not feeling like they belong to their tribe. But that's a whole different topic for a different video. Just because you have Cherokee ancestry, it doesn't make you Cherokee. And just because you're a Cherokee, it doesn't necessarily make you care about the tribe as a people, as a culture, as a history, anything, etc. And on the other side of that, being able to reconnect is a privilege. There are so many forms of privilege involved that I don't have time to go into. But notably, the privilege of time and money. Often both are related. I'm like lower middle class. Maybe I'm like lower class. I don't know. Billion, eat the rich. But I'm lucky enough to have the privilege to not always have to work during times when cultural events take place. Driving that 2-hour round trip to Tahlequah is time consuming, but I do have a functioning vehicle that allows me to make that trip. Time, money, transportation, childcare, etc. are all things that have to be accounted for and are a privilege if you have them taken care of. One of the first new airbenders that the gang meets is Kuon, a farmer and a family man. Tenzin asks him to come study at the air temples with him, and Kuon is adamant that he can't just abandon his responsibilities.
You expect me to abandon my entire life? My family? No! No, sir! I'm not going anywhere with you, and I think it's best that you leave!
And I can't blame him. I understand not wanting to uproot your entire life just because you suddenly got magical powers, because that's all that airbending is to these people. at least at first. It's just a cool new ability that you have that you can choose to polish or not. It's not tied to thousands of years of culture and history and community, because harmonic convergence doesn't care about culture, it cares about balance. Ryu tells Korra the same thing.
Whatever. I didn't ask to become an airbender, you know?
Speaking of Korra, she has a far different approach than Tenzin does.
You're an airbender now, and you have a responsibility as a citizen of the world.
Tenzin has a personal mission to restore airbenders and an air nation as the son of Avatar Aang, the last airbender. Korra's mentality is that of responsibility and of a sense of duty and moral obligation. And that's a really interesting idea that's worth talking about. Is it their responsibility as citizens of the world to become air nomads, to restore the culture, to rebuild this community, to learn thousands of years of history, especially as people who are not descendants of people affected by genocide, especially when they have no connection to this culture? These people who already have a culture, they came from Earth Kingdom places that certainly have their own culture and history and traditions. Of course, as an Indigenous person, I do know what my answer is. I do feel an obligation to overcome colonialism and imperialism in some way. I'm sure that my brother, who is just as Indigenous as I am, doesn't feel the same moral obligation. Without getting into the politics of who is and isn't Native, which is not the purpose of this video, I am almost certain that elders of any tribe will tell you that everybody has a responsibility to their tribe and to the world. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, which I cannot recommend enough. I read it for the first time like a year ago, and it changed my life. Robin Wall Kimmerer speaks extensively about gifts and responsibilities. Duties and gifts are two sides of the same coin. Eagles were given the gift of far sight, so it is their duty to watch over us. Rain fulfills its duty as it falls, because it was given the gift of sustaining life. What is the duty of a human? If gifts and responsibilities are one, then asking, what is our responsibility, is the same as asking, what is our gift? What that responsibility looks like is different for everyone. I've been given the gift of access to nearly unlimited knowledge via the internet. I feel then that it is my responsibility to know my ancestors' names, who survived the Trail of Tears, who came to Oklahoma because they had no other choice, who were on the Dawes roll and whose names are attached to the land allotments that may or may not still be in my family. I also feel that it is my responsibility to learn to be a better steward of the land that they lived on, that they were forced onto, that they and many other tribes call home, and to support my cousins and my community in any way that I can. Is that enough? For Tenzin, he probably thought that his gift, and therefore his responsibility, was his children, to have as many children as possible in hopes of restoring the airbending population, and to raise them to the best of his ability with the knowledge and culture of his father's people. Is it Jinora, Iki, and Milo's responsibility, then, as citizens of the world, to also have as many kids as possible for the same reasons? Is it my responsibility to put my life on hold and to do the Cherokee Nation language immersion program? Is it my responsibility to have children with a Cherokee partner and to send them to Cherokee schools and immerse them in this culture? I hope not, because I don't want kids, and my partner is not Cherokee. If airbending is their gift, is it also their responsibility? These are questions that I can't answer. Tenzin does eventually accept that the new airbenders didn't choose this life, that they had it thrust upon them, and that it's up to them to choose their path. Of course, for a while he's treated them like military recruits rather than citizens, but that's a topic outside the scope of this video. And the new airbenders do eventually create a sense of community, beginning with the rescue of Kai, Jinora, and the baby bison. They do take care of each other and fulfill communal responsibilities that we really see at the end of Season 3 and into Season 4, but this is not a culture that they were born into. What culture were you born into? What culture should you have been born into? What did colonialism, imperialism, and genocide take from you? And what's your responsibility? Special thanks to my supporters on Patreon: Josh Ferguson, Dalton I Am the Teacup McAdoo, Alexis Womack, Brian Barnes, Paige, Avi Finkel, Zara Shmara, and Will Golden. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, the link is in the description. Thank you for watching. Buy my stickers.